There is a Stormtrooper helmet on the wall of what feels like every other flat I've ever visited, sitting on a shelf, usually next to something more respectable, a framed print, a little succulent, some books that are definitely more impressive than the ones the person has actually read. Just sitting there, white and impassive, the permanent, angry frown, the black insect eyes. And the thing I find genuinely interesting about that image is that this is a design that was created to represent a fascist empire's anonymous foot soldiers. The whole visual idea was that these were people without expression, without identity, without anything that made them distinct from one another. And somehow, across decades of films and television and books and games and Halloween costumes, they became one of the most beloved pieces of design in popular culture. The villain's army became everybody's favourite aesthetic object. I find that paradox worth sitting with for a moment before we get into anything else tonight, because I think it says something real about why the Stormtrooper lore is as deep and genuinely strange as it is. There's always been something underneath the armour that people keep wanting to excavate, and the more time you spend excavating it, the more you find not just interesting military history and design decisions, but genuinely unsettling questions about coercion and identity and what it means to be shaped by a system from before you were capable of consent. The franchise has been asking those questions in various registers and with varying degrees of self-awareness for about 50 years. Some of it is in the films, a lot of it is in the novels and animated series and comics that most people haven't encountered. Tonight we're going to cover the full arc, where the design came from, how the army was actually built inside the fiction, the mechanics of how it was sustained, and a handful of the stranger detours the lore has taken over the years. Some of it is the kind of thing you'd call disturbing if you weren't tired, and interesting if you are. I think it earns both descriptions. We'll be moving through roughly a century of in-universe history and about 50 years of the franchise's real-world development, and the two timelines are worth holding separately in your head. What Lucas and his collaborators intended in 1977, and what hundreds of writers, showrunners, and artists have done with the same material across the decades since. Both stories are interesting. They don't always agree with each other, and the places where they diverge are sometimes more revealing than the places where they line up. There's no particular rush. We'll move through it at an easy pace, and if you're the sort of person who finds a subscribe button before settling in, which does genuinely help, now would be a fine moment. Otherwise, let's just get into it. Everything about the Stormtrooper begins with a brief George Lucas gave to a concept artist in the early 1970s, before anyone knew whether Star Wars would get made, before there was a script worth the name, before any of this existed as anything other than a set of images someone was being asked to put on paper. The brief, as it was later described, went something like this: totally obedient, the ultimate soldier without any feeling at all. If given an order, they do it. Better off being people without expression. That's the entire creative mandate. A person who is not a person. A soldier who is a function. And Ralph McQuarrie, the concept artist George Lucas brought in first, apparently the very first person he hired for the project, took that mandate and produced something that nobody has quite managed to improve on in the 50 years since. McQuarrie's process, as he described it in interviews and reference materials over the years, started with pencil drawings and then moved into full production paintings. He'd been thinking about samurai armor, about the visual vocabulary of Japanese warrior aesthetics, and about how you translate that into something that read as futuristic without being chrome and neon sci-fi. He admitted he didn't think the film would ever get made. He thought it was too complicated, too expensive, not quite suited to the audience that existed at the time. He did the work anyway, because George Lucas knew things he didn't. One of the more interesting early details in the concept art is that the prototype Stormtrooper was depicted wielding a lightsaber. Not as an enemy in specific scenes, but as a general visual concept, the idea that these soldiers might be something more than ordinary infantry. That didn't survive into the final film, but it tells you something about where the design was beginning, which was as a kind of future knight. The armour was always meant to evoke medieval protection as much as space-age technology. Getting that design into physical existence fell to a small group of people working in and around Twickenham, England in 1976. Brian Muir and Liz Moore divided the sculpting work between them. They took a cast of a model's body in plaster and then built the armour in clay over the form, with an ongoing process of committees coming in and saying, take a bit off here, take a bit off there, over the course of several weeks. John Mollo handled the costume design, working out how the armour would actually function on a human body, where the brakes would need to be to allow movement, how the helmet would sit. In 1978, Mollo won the Academy Award for Best Costume Design for his work on Star Wars, the first time a science fiction film had ever won that category, which is a fun detail that tends to get forgotten. The actual vacuum-formed armour pieces were made by Andrew Ainsworth, working from a studio near Twickenham. This later became the subject of a years-long legal dispute about intellectual property and who owned the right to reproduce the design, which is a story in its own right, and one I find quietly hilarious given how the dispute was essentially about who could legally sell replicas of plastic armour for a fascist space army. There's a quote from the production period that I always come back to when I think about the design. Someone describing what Macquarie's concept art suggested, that the Stormtrooper was a futuristic being that had evolved through continuous genetic modification, perhaps able to operate in adverse climatic conditions, and that the armour would be so flexible that it actually could have grown on the character that way, much the same way as an armadillo has natural armour. I don't know exactly where that description originates, but I find it fascinating that the physical armour, made of vacuum-formed plastic in a studio in Middlesex, was being conceptualised as something almost biological, something that had grown, which, as we'll get to in a bit, is an interesting way to frame it given what the lore eventually does with the idea of soldiers who are made rather than born. What the design succeeded at, undeniably, is exactly what the brief asked for. The face is not a face, it's a surface. The black eye sockets read as empty. The permanent downward curve at what passes for a mouth is not anger exactly, it's just the absence of accommodation. There is nothing in that helmet that is going to negotiate with you or take your circumstances into account. The design communicates exactly what Lucas wanted it to communicate, and it does so simply and completely. That's genuinely difficult to achieve. The John Mollo connection is worth a small tangent because Mollo had an unusual background for a film costume designer. He was primarily a military historian and illustrator, known for his books on military uniforms across history. George Lucas hired him specifically because of that expertise, because he wanted the imperial military to feel like it had a genuine institutional history behind it, a sense that people had made these design decisions over time for reasons that made sense to the people making them. Mollo brought to the costumes the same sensibility he'd developed studying how real armies dressed their soldiers, the way rank was communicated, the way function and ceremony overlapped, the visual grammar of authority. The Stormtrooper armour, under Mollo's eye, became something that felt like it had been issued rather than designed, like it existed in a world that had been going on for a long time before we arrived. There's also the interesting question of what the armour was communicating in the specific context of 1977, when A New Hope was released. Several film scholars have noted that the white armour, the rigid uniformity, the facelessness, was visually rhyming with images and aesthetics that were fresh in cultural memory in ways they might not be now. Lucas has occasionally talked about the influence of Leni Riefenstahl and the visual spectacle of Nazi rallies on the design language of the Empire, the mass uniformity, the overwhelming scale, the way individual identity dissolves into the collective. The Stormtrooper, as a visual idea, was doing some of that work, whether or not any given audience member consciously registered it. And yet here we are, 50 years on, with Stormtrooper helmets on the shelves of perfectly ordinary people. The image that was built to represent faceless, unfeeling authority became the thing people put next to their houseplants. I don't have a tidy explanation for that, but I find it interesting every time I think about it. The in-universe history of how these soldiers came to exist is, if anything, stranger than the out-of-universe one. And it starts on a planet that had been deleted from the Jedi archives. Not lost, not simply uncharted, deliberately removed from the records so that nobody would know it was there. Which is, when you think about it, a reasonably alarming thing to find out about a facility that turns out to be a planet-scale human cloning operation. Ku-Mino is a water world, entirely covered in ocean, with the civilization built on platforms above a perpetual storm. The Kaminoans themselves are tall, pale, slightly elongated beings who approach the business of creating life with the detached professionalism of very good accountants. They were commissioned to build an army for the Republic by a Jedi master named Sifo Dyas, who apparently had some kind of precognitive sense that a war was coming and decided to do something about it, alone, without telling the Jedi Council. He ordered the army, and then the Sith arranged for him to be killed and quietly took over his project, which they had been planning to use for entirely different purposes all along. The genetic template for the army was Jango Fett, a Mandalorian bounty hunter who, by all accounts, was genuinely exceptional at the things bounty hunters are supposed to be good at. He agreed to provide his DNA for what was essentially an enormous sum of money. His one additional condition was that the Kaminoans produce one unaltered clone, not modified, not accelerated, not conditioned in any particular way, a clone he could raise as a son. That clone was Boba Fett, who is his own entire story, and one we're not going to get into tonight. The rest of the clones received several significant modifications to the Fett genome. The Kaminoans reduced their independence, made them more docile and compliant than their genetic template. Jango Fett, as an individual, was apparently not a particularly easy man to manage. The clones were designed to be more manageable. They were also given accelerated aging, the ability to grow to physical adulthood in approximately 10 years rather than the standard 20, meaning the army could be battle-ready in half the time. This had a cost, which was that the clones aged at roughly twice the natural human rate, and under the stress of combat, that rate appeared to increase further. What this means in practice is that clone troopers, who were physically in their late teens or early 20s at the start of the Clone Wars, were already physiologically approaching middle age by its end 3 years later. The ones who survived Order 66 and lived into the Rebellion era were physically ancient men, while still being, in chronological terms, comparatively young. That's a detail the franchise handles with real care in its later animated work, and it's one of the more genuinely affecting aspects of the whole story. What the Kaminoans did not anticipate, or did not adequately suppress, was individuality. Within roughly a year of the Clone Wars beginning, clones were giving themselves nicknames. Not their official designations, but actual names. Rex, Fives, Echo, Hardcase, Cody. Names they chose for themselves, or earned from the people around them. Names that meant something. The Kaminoan cloning process was designed to produce interchangeable soldiers, and it produced people instead. Which, depending on your perspective, is either a testament to the fundamental resilience of personhood or a significant quality control failure. There's a clone called 99 who appears in the Clone Wars, and who I think about more than is probably reasonable. He was physically incapable of military service due to a genetic abnormality, slow, stooped, not built for combat in any meaningful sense. He was kept at the Tipoca City facility on Ku-Mino and assigned to maintenance work. He's depicted as genuinely kind, deeply proud of his fellow clones, in a way that isn't resentful of what they can do. And he cannot. And he dies trying to help defend the facility during a separatist assault. The system produced him as a defect, and he remained at that facility until the end, and the show doesn't shy away from what that means. He's one of the more quietly moving characters in the animated series, which is a strange thing to say about a background figure in a children's cartoon, but there it is. The facility itself, Tipoca City, is worth imagining for a moment if you haven't spent time thinking about what it would actually look like in practice. It's a city built entirely for the purpose of producing an army. Vast training halls that function as the schools, growth chambers, where thousands of embryos develop simultaneously, canteens and dormitories for people who were grown specifically to live and eat and sleep in them, and the Kaminoans moving through all of it with the quiet efficiency of people who have become entirely accustomed to what they do there. There's no drama in it for them. It's a manufacturing facility that happens to produce people, and they treat it accordingly. There's a sense in the way the facility is depicted across various Star Wars media that the Kaminoans genuinely didn't understand what they'd made. They built a population of people while believing they were building a supply of soldiers, and the distinction, which seems obvious from the outside, apparently required the actual experiences of the Clone Wars to fully register, if it ever did. The clones resisting their designations, developing bonds with their Jedi commanders, grieving their dead, giving each other nicknames. The Kaminoans kept running quality control assessments and filing the results under unexpected behavioural variation. It reads in context as something close to institutional blindness. So here is the thing about the inhibitor chips that I find most unsettling, and it's not the obvious part. The obvious part, that there was a secret program to brainwash an entire army of soldiers into murdering their commanding officers on a single command, is, yes, obviously alarming. But the part that sits with me is where the chips were installed. Not implanted later, not inserted during training or conditioning. The chips were placed at the third stage of embryonic development, before the clones were recognisably anything. The programming was in them before they were born, in any meaningful sense of the word. The chips were organic biochips, grown into the brain tissue rather than placed mechanically, which made them nearly undetectable because they didn't read as foreign objects during most scans. Jedi Master Sifo Dyas, who commissioned the whole project, had originally designed them as a safeguard, a contingency measure in case a Jedi commander went rogue and tried to use their clone forces for something improper. The idea was that the chip would allow for a kind of override, a check on Jedi authority if it was ever misused. By the standards of what the Republic was trying to build, it wasn't entirely unreasonable. After Sifo Dyas was killed, the Sith took over the project and added a second function to the chip, a secret one, sitting dormant inside every clone's brain for the entire duration of the Clone Wars. The Kaminoans knew, the Jedi didn't, and the second function was Order 66, a command that, when issued, would activate the chips and override the clone's independent thought, suppressing hesitation and heightening aggression, specifically and only toward Jedi. The people the clones had been fighting alongside for years, the people some of them had come to genuinely care about. The ARC trooper called Fives is the one who came closest to exposing the whole thing, and his story is one of the bleaker threads in the Clone Wars. It started when a trooper called Tup's chip malfunctioned during the Battle of Ringo Vinda, causing a premature, involuntary execution of the Order. Tup turned mid-battle and killed a Jedi general before collapsing. Fives investigated, had his own chip removed, traced the conspiracy all the way to Coruscant, and ended up alone in a room with Palpatine, knowing the truth and having nobody who would believe him. Palpatine told the Jedi that Fives had been infected by a rare parasite from Ringo Vinda that had driven him paranoid. He had Fives killed by a clone commander, even after Fives had tried to explain what he'd found to Anakin and Rex. The last thing Fives managed to do was whisper something to Rex, who had been his friend and commanding officer, about the chips and what was coming. Rex never submitted a formal complaint about the chips having an alternate purpose. The complaint went nowhere. Both Top and Fives, in the period after their chips were removed, described experiencing Order 66 in their nightmares, a mission they kept experiencing involuntarily while they were asleep, like a command their minds couldn't stop generating. The implication being that the dormant programming was producing traces even without activation. I find that detail genuinely haunting, personally. The idea of carrying something in your head that surfaces in your dreams, something that's going to kill people you love, and having no way to explain it to anyone who would listen. When Order 66 was finally issued, the chips activated in the overwhelming majority of clones across the galaxy simultaneously. Clone troopers turned on their Jedi generals mid-battle during quiet moments at dinner. Some Jedi survived, most didn't. The clones followed the order with efficiency and without apparent distress, because the chip blocked the part of the brain that would have produced distress. They were not experiencing the full weight of what they were doing. Their free will was being suppressed by a piece of organic technology that had been growing in their heads since before they were born. This was a retcon introduced in Season 6 of the Clone Wars, and it has been genuinely controversial among fans ever since. George Lucas's original position was that the clones knew what they were doing and made a conscious choice to follow the order, and that this was the dark heart of it, that ordinary soldiers made the choice, that the complicity was real and chosen. The chip version removed that complicity, or at least complicated it. I understand both readings, and I find them both uncomfortable in different ways, which is probably the honest response to have. There's a version of the argument that the chip makes the story more emotionally resonant, not less, because the relationship between a clone trooper and their Jedi commander, built over years of shared experience and genuine affection, suddenly takes on a weight that it wouldn't otherwise carry. Every moment of warmth, every instance of loyalty, every time a clone chose to put themselves between a Jedi and danger, all of it is now happening in the presence of a dormant program that is eventually going to undo it. The chip doesn't remove the connection, it makes the connection tragic in a specific and irreversible way. Rex and Ahsoka's friendship over the course of the Clone Wars is one of the most carefully developed relationships in the franchise. And the final arc of the show is about the two of them on a ship where that dormant program has just activated in every clone aboard. That's a specific kind of grief that the chip version enables, not removes. The counter-argument, which is Lucas's original argument and still has force, is that removing agency removes moral weight. A soldier who couldn't have done otherwise is not making a choice. And there's something in the original conception of Order 66, where the clones chose compliance over everything they'd built with the Jedi, that registers as a specifically human failure, in a way the chip version can't quite replicate. Both versions are disturbing. They're disturbing in different ways. There's a scene in Revenge of the Sith that I always find difficult to watch, not because of its scale, but because of its specificity. Commander Cody, a clone who has been fighting alongside Obi-Wan Kenobi for years, who has just been involved in a successful mission with him, who presumably knows Kenobi as well as any of the clones know their Jedi generals, receives the order, turns, and fires at Obi-Wan's retreating back without apparent hesitation. The chip version says Cody had no choice in that moment. The pre-chip version says he made one. Neither version is comfortable. In either version, a person who Obi-Wan trusted tried to kill him the moment the order came. The relationship, whatever it had been, simply ended. That's what the scene is about, regardless of the mechanism. Not all of them did it. That's worth saying clearly before moving on, because the story of the clones who resisted Order 66 is one of the more interesting threads in the whole lore, and the reasons for the resistance vary enough to say something meaningful about what kind of system the clones were living inside. Captain Rex is the most prominent. He'd received Fives' dying words about the chips and had filed that report, and somewhere in the back of his mind, even without fully understanding what Fives had been trying to tell him, something remained. During the execution of Order 66, Ahsoka Tano, the former Jedi Padawan who had been with Rex through most of the war, managed to get through to him just long enough for her to remove his chip. The show depicts this as a genuinely close thing. A few more seconds and it might not have worked. Rex survived, went into hiding, and lived a long time. By the era of Star Wars Rebels, set roughly 15 years after Order 66, he's an old man living in a decommissioned walker in the middle of nowhere with two other aged clones, Commander Wolf and Captain Gregor, both of whom had also had their chips removed at some point. They're depicted as content, more or less, living quietly, having found a way to be people rather than soldiers. Rex eventually joins the rebellion and fights at the Battle of Endor, which means he was there for both the beginning of the Empire and, in a real sense, its end. Clone Force 99, the Bad Batch, resisted Order 66 for a different reason. They were a squad of clones with genetic mutations that had made them exceptional in specific ways. One was a sniper with extraordinary precision, one had enhanced strength, one had technology-based skills, one had tactical acuity beyond normal clone parameters. The mutations that made them unusual also, apparently, gave them a degree of immunity to the chip's activation, because their genetic profiles were different enough from the standard template that the programming didn't fully take hold. Their immunity was called a defect, which is a very specific word choice by the system that produced them. Cut Lorquain had deserted early in the Clone Wars, before Order 66 was ever issued, and settled down on a farm, married, started raising a family. He simply wasn't there when the Order went out. He just left and made a different life, which in some ways is the most human-scale version of resistance in the whole story. Not heroic, not dramatic, just gone. There's also the question of what to do with the ones who didn't resist. The debate George Lucas set up, that the original intent was for the clones to have made a real choice, has never fully gone away even after the chips were introduced. Because even with the chips, the galaxy-spanning unanimity of the response suggests the conditioning went beyond the implant. Years of training to follow orders, to trust the chain of command, to treat protocol as identity. That would have done a lot of the work even without the neurological override. The chip made it nearly impossible to resist. The conditioning made resistance almost unthinkable even before the chip fired. The few who resisted did so because something in them persisted past the conditioning, past the programming, past all of it. Rex hearing Fives' words and keeping them somewhere. The Bad Batch's mutations creating an accidental loophole. Cut Lorquain having already walked away from everything the system needed him to be. There's something that feels meaningful in all three of those, though I'm not entirely sure I can articulate what. It's worth briefly mentioning Commander Fox, who sits at the other end of the spectrum from Rex and represents something different. Fox was the commander of the Coruscant Guard, the Stormtroopers stationed on the galactic capital, and his record during the Clone Wars includes hunting down Ahsoka Tano on false charges and killing Fives, the clone who had just discovered the truth about Order 66 in the line of duty. There's a fan theory, which I find genuinely compelling, and even if it isn't officially canon, that the Coruscant Guard's chips were being activated more frequently than other units, used for the kind of covert work Palpatine needed done in the capital that he couldn't allow the participants to remember clearly afterward. It would explain a certain quality of Fox's behaviour that goes beyond even the standard Imperial compliance. Whether it's true in any official sense or not, it captures something true about how authoritarian systems use their most proximate enforcers. Fox eventually died by Darth Vader's hand, which is perhaps its own kind of comment on the relationship between the Emperor and the soldiers who served him most directly. There's one more clone resistor worth mentioning, though his story lives mostly in the Legends continuity, a clone medic called Kix, who was the only person Fives had managed to inform about the chips and the conspiracy before being killed, and who spent his final weeks before Order 66 trying to verify what Fives had told him and figure out how to act on it. He was discovered by separatist agents working for Count Dooku, who apparently realised what he knew and wanted to ensure the information didn't reach the wrong people. They put him in cryostasis. He spent about 50 years frozen on a derelict ship before being discovered. He woke up in Legends to a galaxy that had already had the Empire, the Rebellion, and was well into the New Republic era. Everyone he'd known was gone. The war he'd been trying to prevent had happened, exactly as Fives had warned it would, while he'd been in suspension. I find that a genuinely affecting image, the one clone who came closest to stopping it, arriving 50 years too late. The first Imperial Stormtroopers were clones. That's easy to forget when you're watching the original trilogy, where the Stormtroopers are clearly human beings moving around inside white plastic armor. You can hear their voices, see their body language, occasionally watch one bang his head on a door frame. But in the immediate aftermath of the Clone Wars, the soldiers who enforced the Emperor's rule across the galaxy were the same clone army that had just fought the war. They'd been given new armor, specifically designed to be more intimidating than the Republic's phased T2 clone armor, more angular, more threatening, and a new purpose which was to enforce the new order across however many star systems needed enforcing. The problem with this arrangement was several things at once. Jango Fett had died during the Battle of Geonosis, the opening engagement of the Clone Wars, and without the original template, producing new Fett genome clones was increasingly difficult. Clones were also extraordinarily expensive. Each one required years of intensive growth, training, and maintenance, and the accelerated aging, which had seemed like a useful feature when you needed a battle-ready army quickly, was now a liability. The clones were burning out. By the time of the events of A New Hope, only roughly a third of active Stormtroopers were still original Fett template clones. The rest were something else. Project Warmantle was the Imperial program that handled the transition. The idea was to replace the Clone Corps with human recruits, people who had enlisted voluntarily or been conscripted through Imperial academies, or been drawn in by the considerable propaganda apparatus the Empire was running across the galaxy. The recruits were designated TK Stormtroopers, which is where the TK prefix that shows up throughout the original trilogy comes from. They wore armour inspired by the Macquarie concept art that had slightly different proportions from the clone armour. There's a real-world reason the Bad Batch's depiction of early TK troopers uses a transitional design, and they were trained at Imperial facilities across the galaxy. Here is the detail that I find quietly poignant about all of this. The people training the first wave of TK recruits were clone commandos. The elite soldiers, who had been the backbone of the Republic's military, were now serving as instructors for the army that was replacing them, teaching the new generation of soldiers how to do the job that the new generation of soldiers was being deployed specifically so that the clones wouldn't have to do it anymore. Whether any individual clone instructor found this situation demoralizing or simply treated it as their assignment is something the lore leaves largely unexplored, but I think about it. The transition wasn't clean or sudden. For years, the Stormtrooper Corps was a mix of aging clones and new recruits, with the clones generally having significantly higher competence, and the recruits having the advantage of not burning out at twice the normal human rate. In the Legends continuity, the few remaining original Fett clones had something close to contempt for the new recruits, considering them profoundly inferior soldiers. The gap in training, in genetic conditioning, in sheer years of institutional knowledge was real and significant. But the Empire had decided that an endless supply of serviceable soldiers was more strategically useful than a diminishing supply of excellent ones, and the logic, if not exactly inspiring, was consistent with how the Empire approached most things. The Bad Batch episode that depicts the first TK troopers in training has a clone commander explaining the situation plainly. These recruits come from all over the galaxy. They swear loyalty to the Empire. They're not as skilled, but there's an endless supply of them. The narrator in me that's been reading Star Wars for a long time finds something almost elegiac about that line. The end of something remarkable being described in the most pragmatic possible terms. The propaganda operation that ran alongside the transition is documented in the Star Wars propaganda reference book, and it's genuinely sophisticated. The Empire used the clones' popularity, the public affection for the soldiers who had fought and died in the Clone Wars, to drive recruitment into the new human Stormtrooper Corps. Advertisements and recruitment posters across the galaxy invoke the legacy of the clone army, while quietly not mentioning that what you were signing up for was meaningfully different from it. You'd be wearing similar armor, you'd be assigned a similar designation. The clone's sacrifice would be the story told at your induction ceremony, and then you'd be sent to enforce policies that the Clone Wars had been fought to prevent becoming permanent. There's a kind of institutional sleight of hand in using the moral authority of one thing to recruit people into a different thing, and the Empire was very good at it. The first generation of human stormtroopers genuinely believed they were continuing the Clone Wars' protective mission rather than serving as the instrument of the thing those wars had created. There's also something worth noting about the timing of the transition. The Bad Batch, which depicts the earliest period of the Empire, suggests the shift to human recruits began almost immediately, not gradually over years, but as a fairly urgent priority from very early in the Imperial era. Part of this was practical. The clones were expensive and aging out, but part of it may have been ideological. The Clone Wars had been fought with an army that didn't choose to serve. The clones had no meaningful alternative to service. The Empire, projecting a new political order to the galaxy, may have wanted an army whose loyalty could be framed as chosen rather than engineered. Stormtroopers who had signed up, who had academy pins and graduation ceremonies, whose families might be proud of their service. That's a different propaganda product from an army grown in vats on a remote ocean planet. Whether any of that ideological framing was sincere or purely instrumental is something the lore doesn't resolve. The Empire was perfectly capable of being cynical about its own mythology. But the optics mattered, and a volunteer army, even a deeply imperfect and partially coerced one, had optics that a clone army simply couldn't produce. TK-421 is the first Stormtrooper designation we ever hear spoken aloud in Star Wars. It comes in A New Hope, when Luke Skywalker has disguised himself as a Stormtrooper aboard the Death Star, and an officer notices that TK-421's post has been abandoned. "Why aren't you at your post, TK-421?" It's a throwaway line, the kind of incidental world building that A New Hope does so naturally you barely clock it at the time. But it's the moment the film quietly tells you what the Empire thinks its soldiers are. Numbers. The operating number system wasn't complicated. 2 letters followed by 3 or 4 numerals. Officers had a slightly different format. Low numbers generally indicated higher rank. The letters varied depending on unit and function, TK for standard infantry, LS for stormtrooper officers in certain formations, and a handful of other prefixes that show up in various corners of the expanded universe. The whole system was designed for administrative efficiency and the rapid identification of replaceable personnel. Clone troopers in the Republic era had received similar designations, CT numbers, also 2 letters, and numerals. But here's the distinction the lore draws quite carefully. Within a year of the Clone Wars, the clones had stopped using their CT designations in anything except official communications. Rex was CT-7567 in the records. In the field, in conversation, in everything that mattered, he was Rex. The clones gave themselves names because they wanted them, and they used them because the people around them were willing to use them too. The Jedi commanders, for the most part, engaged with the clones as individuals, called them by their names. The nicknames proliferated. Imperial Stormtroopers were human beings, with birth names who, by the time they completed training and were assigned to active duty, were expected to function as their designation. Not to use their names, not to be addressed by their names. TK-626 went to a station on some Outer Rim installation, not whoever they had been before. The individual was, in the Empire's accounting, irrelevant. The First Order carried this logic to its most complete expression. FN-2187, who becomes Finn, had never in his life been addressed by a name. He had been taken as an infant and raised under a designation code, trained under a designation code, deployed under a designation code. When Poe Dameron asked him during their escape what his name was, the genuine answer was the only name they ever gave me, a string of alphanumeric characters. Poe said, "I'm giving you that," and gave him Finn in about 30 seconds. I find that exchange enormously affecting every time I think about it, partly because it's so quick and so casual, the way it probably would be in reality. Poe is not making a grand statement about personhood and identity. He just gives his new friend a name, because obviously you should have a name. And Finn takes it immediately, without hesitation, because of course he does. He'd never had one. The smallest possible act of recognition, offered in passing, while fleeing an exploding shuttle. That's doing quite a lot of work. The TK designation system also reflects something true about how authoritarian institutions process soldiers in general, the number being a way of signalling interchangeability, of making clear that what matters is the function, not the individual filling it. If TK-5331 dies, TK-5332 is already in the pipeline. The armor makes them visually identical. The designation makes them administratively identical. The system does not particularly need them to be people. The Mandalorian revisits TK numbers in a scene in Season 2 that I think is one of the more quietly effective pieces of writing in the live-action Star Wars shows. Din Djarin is undercover as an Imperial personnel carrier pilot, and a Stormtrooper addresses him by his alphanumeric designation as part of a routine interaction. It's a small scene, procedural, and the weight of it comes from what we already know, that every person in that exchange has been reduced to a code by the system they're operating inside, and that this is completely normal to everyone involved. The scene doesn't comment on it, it just shows it. That restraint is the right choice. There's something worth dwelling on in the parallel between the clone CT designations and the Imperial TK numbers. The clones were given codes and developed names anyway, through the insistence of their own personalities and the willingness of the Jedi to meet them where they were. The Imperial Stormtroopers were given codes and for the most part remained codes. The difference wasn't genetic, it was institutional. The Jedi engaged with their soldiers as people. Imperial officers generally didn't. The system you're inside shapes what's possible inside it. Luke Skywalker, disguised as a stormtrooper aboard the Death Star, says, "I can't see a thing in this helmet." He says it more or less immediately, in a slightly exasperated tone, as if this is already becoming a problem. It's played for a brief laugh, and then the plot moves on. But it's a piece of genuine in-universe information that the franchise later confirmed in a much more direct way when in Star Wars Rebels, Captain Rex, one of the most capable soldiers the Clone Wars produced, puts on a stormtrooper helmet, attempts to aim a blaster, misses everything, and yells, "It's this helmet, I can't see," before throwing it at someone and immediately beginning to hit every shot. The visual priority of the armor design, intimidating, uniform, expressionless, came at a cost to the soldiers actually wearing it. The viewport in the stormtrooper helmet was not optimized for marksmanship. Rex, who had spent years fighting in well-designed clone trooper armor, was a significantly impaired soldier the moment he switched to the Imperial kit. That says something about where the Empire's priorities were. The armor did other things reasonably well. The suits were sealed environments, they filtered air, had thermal regulation, could function in vacuum for short periods, and provided genuine protection against environmental hazards. The snowtrooper variants deployed to Hoth were actually quite well thought out for extreme cold operations, with additional insulation and the sealed helmet providing real protection. The Sandtrooper variants used on Tatooine had additional cooling and filtration for desert conditions. Whoever was doing the environmental specialization work was paying attention to the actual problem they were trying to solve. What the standard armor was less good at was stopping blaster fire, which you would think would be the primary requirement. The armor appears to be more psychological than protective in direct combat. It was designed to look impenetrable without necessarily being so, because the Empire's broader military doctrine was built on overwhelming force, rather than the survival of individual troopers. If you have 100 Stormtroopers and 10 die, 90 remain. The attrition is acceptable in a way it wouldn't be if you were fielding a small elite force that took years to train. The pay structure is a detail I find genuinely revealing. A 2017 Star Wars short story anthology confirmed that Imperial Stormtroopers had their pay adjusted based on shooting accuracy. The Empire tried to use financial incentives to improve aim. This is the kind of management decision that sounds reasonable in a meeting and then produces 19 blaster bolts fired at close range without hitting a single rebel, which happened repeatedly in the Death Star escape sequence. Whether the incentive scheme worked is not something the lore addresses with great confidence. Life as an actual soldier in the Imperial Corps varied considerably depending on when and where you were serving. The earliest human recruits in the years immediately following the Clone Wars often genuinely believed in what they were doing. The novel Lost Stars, which follows two Imperial officers across the entire span of the Galactic Civil War, depicts people who enlisted not because they were coerced or deceived in any crude sense, but because the Empire represented order and stability after a genuinely terrible war. They were ambitious, intelligent young people from a backwater planet for whom the Imperial Academy was the most promising path available. They didn't understand, at the point of signing up, what the institution they were joining was actually prepared to do. That understanding came gradually, for most of them, and at different rates, and with different consequences. Some found ways to accommodate what they discovered. Some didn't. It's a much more honest portrait of how institutions like this function than the franchise sometimes manages, and I think it makes the Stormtrooper as a figure considerably more interesting than the faceless drone version would allow. One thing the lore establishes quite clearly, across multiple sources, is that the experience of being a Stormtrooper varied enormously depending on where you were stationed. A trooper on Coruscant in the capital, enforcing Imperial law in a relatively stable environment, had a very different daily reality from a trooper deployed to an occupied Outer Rim world where the population was actively resistant. The former was, by most accounts, a fairly institutional existence, maintaining order, standing posts, doing the work of visible authority in a place that didn't particularly want to be challenged. The latter was more complicated, involving operations against civilians that the recruitment materials had not prepared anyone for. The attrition numbers in the Outer Rim, especially during the early years of the Galactic Civil War, were significant. Rebel insurgent cells were effective in ways that the Imperial propaganda apparatus consistently downplayed, which meant that individual troopers were often experiencing a very different war from the one they'd been told they were fighting. Something else the lore establishes, through a handful of stories told from the Stormtrooper perspective, is the particular quality of dehumanization that comes from the helmet itself. Not just the visual effect it has on people looking at you, but the psychological effect it has on you wearing it. When your face is covered, when the person you're looking at can't see your expression and you can't fully read theirs, something in the social dynamic shifts. You become, in some operational sense, less of a person and more of a function. The helmet was designed to communicate that to the people being policed. It apparently also communicated it, over time, to the people wearing it. Obi-Wan Kenobi says, "Early in A New Hope, only Imperial Stormtroopers are so precise." And he says it while examining the charred wreckage of a Jawa sandcrawler. He's making an identification, drawing on his experience of how the Empire operates, pointing to the quality of the work as evidence of who did it. And this line, delivered as a statement of straightforward fact about the Empire's elite soldiers, has spent nearly 50 years being the setup to one of science fiction's more enduring jokes. Because the film then proceeds to show you 2 hours of those precise soldiers firing blasters and not hitting anything. A 2017 reference book, Star Wars Super Graphic, actually counted the missed shots during the Death Star escape sequence specifically. The answer was 119 blaster bolts fired during that sequence that did not connect with a target. That's the official canonical number, published and verified. It's a remarkable statistic. There is, however, a reasonably coherent in-universe explanation for that specific sequence that the film actually provides, if you're paying attention to it. When the heroes escape the Death Star on the Millennium Falcon, Leia says, clearly on camera, "They let us go." She says it with certainty. She's been on enough Imperial ships to know when an escape is too easy. And in the very next scene, we learn she was right. Darth Vader had placed a tracker on the ship, and the entire plan was to let them fly directly to the Rebel base. The Stormtroopers weren't missing because they were incompetent. They were missing because the order was to let the targets escape while appearing to try to prevent it. The film gave us the answer in real time, and a significant portion of the audience decided it was a plot hole for 40 years. That said, the broader pattern across the entire saga of Stormtroopers being ineffective soldiers against main characters cannot be fully explained by they were ordered to miss on this specific occasion. Some of it is the helmet, as we've established. Some of it is the transition from genetically engineered, combat-trained from birth clone soldiers to humans who completed an academy program, which produced a measurable drop in average combat effectiveness. The Empire prioritized numbers over quality, which means you have a very large number of soldiers who are adequately trained rather than a smaller number who are exceptionally trained. There's also a force-based theory that some fans find satisfying, which is that the main character's survival is not coincidental, but is in some sense guided, that the Force itself is influencing the outcomes of these engagements. Chirrut Imwe's repeated declaration that he is one with the Force and the Force is with him, combined with his ability to walk through sustained blaster fire completely unharmed, is the most direct articulation of this idea in the films. The counter-argument is that this makes the Force simultaneously very powerful and very specifically interested in narrative outcomes, which is either theologically intriguing or not really a satisfying answer, depending on your disposition. What it adds up to is that Stormtrooper accuracy is a genuinely layered question, with multiple overlapping answers, none of which on its own is fully satisfying, and all of which together produce something reasonably coherent. The Empire built its military around mass and intimidation, rather than precision. The equipment design worked against accuracy. The Force may or may not have opinions about who wins engagements involving specific individuals, and on at least one notable occasion the missing was intentional, 119 times. The standard issue E11 blaster rifle, which is what most Stormtroopers carried throughout the Galactic Civil War, is worth briefly mentioning here because its design priorities are illuminating. The E11 was optimized for rapid fire over accuracy. It could put a lot of bolts in the air quickly, which is useful in the kind of mass engagement the Empire was typically planning for, and less useful when you need to hit a specific moving target at distance. There's a real tension between what the weapon was designed to do and what the situations in the original trilogy tended to require, and the Stormtroopers suffered for it. There's also a fan theory that's been floating around for a while that I find genuinely interesting, even though it has no official canonical backing, which is that Stormtroopers who had doubts about what they were being asked to do might occasionally have missed on purpose. Not consciously, perhaps, but with the kind of subtle, deliberate inaccuracy that an institution can't easily detect or punish. Given that some percentage of any large human army, at any point in history, has had private reservations about the orders it was carrying out, the idea that a few of those 119 shots were genuinely aimed wide is not entirely implausible. The lore doesn't confirm this, but it also doesn't not confirm it. The standard Stormtrooper, white armor, black joints, E11 blaster, interchangeable with everyone else in the unit, is really the baseline version of something that expanded into a genuinely enormous taxonomy over decades of lore. And some of the variants are quite mundane, sensible military adaptations to different environments. Others are considerably stranger, starting with the environmental variants, because they're the straightforward ones. Snow troopers, deployed to cold weather operations like the assault on Hoth in The Empire Strikes Back, wore insulated sealed suits with heating systems and additional protection against extreme temperatures. Their helmets had better viewport design for cold weather conditions. As Stormtrooper design goes, the Snow Trooper is one of the more practically considered. You can look at it and understand exactly what problem it was solving. Sand Troopers on Tatooine had shoulder pauldrons that indicated rank, a visual distinction visible from a distance in bright desert light, plus additional filtration and cooling systems. Shore Troopers, deployed to the tropical environment of Scarif in Rogue One, wore sand-coloured armour with red banding that made considerably more sense for their operational environment than white would have. Scout Troopers are interesting because the design concession toward functionality is visible. They wore lighter armour, less protection, but significantly better mobility. And the helmet had better visibility than the standard issue. The viewport was larger. The overall profile was less obstructive. They rode speeder bikes, did reconnaissance work, operated in situations where moving fast and seeing clearly mattered more than looking uniform. Looking at a scout trooper and a standard stormtrooper, you can actually see the different priorities in the design. Someone thought about what the job required. Death troopers, the canon ones from Rogue One, not the zombie ones we'll get to, are an entirely different proposition. They're tall, clad in all black armour, serving as bodyguards and enforcers for high-ranking Imperial officers and members of the Tarkin Initiative. Their communications were encrypted. When Death Troopers speak to each other in Rogue One, it's scrambled and unintelligible to everyone around them. That detail is quietly unsettling, in a way I find hard to entirely articulate. The idea of soldiers whose conversations are specifically designed to be incomprehensible to everyone in their vicinity, including their own side, is doing something specific about secrecy and control. The Death Trooper program was developed partly in connection with the Tarkin Initiative, the secretive Imperial weapons development arm that was responsible for the Death Star project and several other classified programs. There's a specific logic to having the people guarding your most sensitive military research be soldiers who can communicate in ways that the researchers they're guarding can't eavesdrop on. Whether that's reassuring or alarming from the perspective of the people working in the facility probably depends on how much you trust the institution. Given what the Tarkin Initiative was actually doing, I'd say alarming is the appropriate response. Shadow Troopers went further. Black armour, cloaking devices that rendered them effectively invisible, trained for stealth operations and mass-coordinated attacks. The image of invisible soldiers attacking in large groups, appearing only as sounds and the effect of their weapons, is the kind of concept that sounds abstract until you actually picture it. There's a reason the franchise keeps returning to variations on the Invisible Soldier. Dark Troopers, as depicted in The Mandalorian, took the concept in a different direction entirely. They were essentially battle droids in Stormtrooper-scale armor, or exoskeletons with the human operator eventually removed from the equation. Moff Gideon's Dark Troopers in Season 2 were frightening in a way that standard Stormtroopers rarely manage in the live-action shows, partly because of their physical capabilities and partly because of how the show used them. The slow, methodical advance down the corridor, the deliberate, systematic efficiency. They didn't hesitate. They didn't assess. They weren't making decisions the way a person makes decisions. And the show understood that the scariest version of a soldier is one that is not troubled by the experience of being a soldier. There's a Legends version of the Dark Trooper project that's somewhat more detailed, involving an Imperial general named Rom Moch, who believed the future of warfare was in infantry rather than superweapons like the Death Star, a perfectly reasonable military philosophy, and who developed the Dark Trooper program through several phases, beginning with human soldiers, empowered exoskeletons, and progressing toward entirely unmanned combat units. The Phase 0 version was human operators in armor. Phase 1 was a partial droid hybrid. Phase 2 was the fully autonomous combat droid. Mock's argument was essentially that the Empire was over-reliant on expensive capital ships and planet-destroying superweapons, and that well-equipped infantry was more strategically flexible and considerably harder to blow up with a single proton torpedo down a specific exhaust shaft. He was not entirely wrong, as the history of the Death Stars would suggest. The general taxonomy of Stormtrooper variants across both Legends and current canon runs into the dozens, if you include every named specialization that's ever appeared in any medium. Crimson Troopers for volcanic environments, Lava Troopers for Mustafar specifically, Patrol Troopers on speeder bikes for urban security work, Purge Troopers serving the Inquisitorius. The list keeps expanding with each new Star Wars property, each one representing someone's decision that the existing variants weren't sufficient for a specific operational requirement. The Empire, whatever its other qualities, was thorough about thinking through military specialization. Sometime around 2009, someone at Del Rey Books decided that what the Star Wars universe needed was a proper zombie horror novel set aboard an Imperial Star Destroyer, and the result was Death Troopers by Joe Schreiber, which is one of the more tonally distinctive things to exist under the Star Wars banner. It lives in the Legends continuity, the now non-canonical expanded universe, but elements of what it introduced have made it into official canon in various forms, which means it's worth spending some time on. The setup: an Imperial prison barge called the Purge breaks down in a remote part of space. Its only apparent hope is a Star Destroyer floating nearby, apparently abandoned. A boarding party is sent over to look for parts and supplies. Only about half of them come back, and they bring something with them. What they brought was the result of Project Blackwing, a classified program run by the Imperial Military Department of Advanced Weapons Research. The stated goal of the project was achieving immortality. The scientists were trying to reanimate necrotic tissue using a combination of conventional biology and Sith alchemy. This is a sentence that should have caused several alarm bells to go off in the planning stages. Combining the two approaches to death that have historically been most reliable at producing catastrophic outcomes, and then hoping the results would be useful rather than apocalyptic, is the kind of institutional decision-making that you look back on and find baffling. What they produced was a virus. Technically, it killed its host quickly and then reanimated the body. The things that came back retained enough function to move, to pursue, to attack, but they were not the people who had died in any sense that mattered. Almost 50,000 Imperial personnel on the Star Destroyer in the Legends telling died and returned as what the surviving reports eventually called the Army of the Dead. The virus spread. The ships involved were quarantined. The survivors were, understandably, deeply affected by the experience. Schreiber later wrote a prequel novel, Red Harvest, set during the Old Republic era, which traced the origins of the virus further back, to a Sith Lord named Darth Dreer, who had been pursuing immortality approximately 4,600 years before the Battle of Yavin. Dreer created an elixir that genuinely extended his life. The side effect was that he became infected by his own creation and died of it anyway. His research survived him because research tends to outlast researchers, and various Sith kept returning to the idea over the millennia because apparently nobody's natural response to "the last person who tried this died from it" is, "then we should not do this." Darth Vader, in the legend's telling, was the one who eventually decided the virus might be weaponizable, which is exactly the kind of decision Vader would make. The result was the outbreak on the Vector and subsequent containment efforts. In the official canon, the Blackwing virus was acknowledged in the 2014 mobile game Star Wars Commander, where outbreaks on a planet called Dandoran required both Imperial and Rebel forces to contain it. The canon version is considerably less detailed than the Legends one, but the concept exists in both. There's one more detail about the name that I find particularly Palpatine as a choice. The elite black-armoured Stormtroopers in Rogue One were being developed around the same time as the classified Project Blackwing research was ongoing. Palpatine, apparently aware of the rumours about the zombie project, specifically named his new elite troopers Death Troopers to capitalise on the fear those rumours generated, using the mythology of one horrifying project to make a completely separate group of soldiers more intimidating. That's the kind of move that is genuinely impressive in its cynicism. The Dathomir outbreak in the Legends telling is worth a brief mention because it adds another dimension to the whole thing. A research station on Dathomir, the Night Sister homeworld as it happens, which is either a coincidence or a choice someone made for reasons, experienced a secondary outbreak when scientists attempted to study the virus in a more controlled environment. The connection to the Night Sisters' existing Dark Force abilities apparently complicated containment in ways that hadn't been anticipated. There were incidents involving infected Night Sisters who managed to partially resist the full transformation, combining elements of the virus with the Night Sisters' existing capacity for what the lore calls magic. Vader ordered a quarantine. The original sample and the lead scientist were not recovered. The detail that Palpatine considered the virus too dangerous to continue developing, that even the Emperor, who had precisely zero compunctions about most things, decided Project Blackwing had gone somewhere he didn't want to follow, should be clarifying about what the project was actually producing. The novel itself is worth briefly describing for what it achieves tonally, because it's genuinely unusual in the Star Wars context. Schreiber writes it as proper horror fiction, with the conventions of the genre taken seriously. The virus kills people horribly. The things that return are frightening in ways that are described in detail. Han Solo and Chewbacca appear, which is a tonal choice the book somehow makes work. They function as a kind of deadpan anchor in the middle of the horror, which says something interesting about both of those characters. Han in particular has the quality of someone who has encountered enough terrible things that one more terrible thing, even an unprecedented one involving animate corpses, doesn't fundamentally change his approach to the situation. The 2023 Ahsoka series did something that I don't think anyone fully anticipated when it was announced, which was to introduce canonical zombie stormtroopers in live action in a way that actually worked. It took a bit of setup and a very specific piece of Star Wars mythology to make it land, but it landed. The background, Grand Admiral Thrawn, one of the most capable military commanders in the Star Wars universe, had been stranded in a galaxy called Peridea after the events of Star Wars Rebels, along with the remains of his forces. He'd been there for years. His soldiers, whatever their original training and competence, had spent a long time fighting and surviving in an extragalactic environment with very limited resupply. When we finally see them In Ahsoku, they look like it. Their armor is battered, patched, repaired with whatever was available. Some of it is wrapped in red cloth that turns out to be significant. They're called Night Troopers. The red cloth connects to the Night Sisters of Dathomir, a group of Force-wielding witches whose particular version of the Force expresses itself through what's called magic, and who have a specific power that becomes relevant here: resurrection. The Clone Wars had established this clearly in a Season 4 episode called Massacre, in which an elder Night Sister called Old Darker resurrected the Night Sisters' fallen dead from burial pods. The dead were wrapped in red cloth before being placed in those pods, which meant they could be raised again. The spell produced genuine undead, fully functional, capable of fighting, difficult to stop. Thrawn had forged a working relationship with 3 extremely powerful Night Sisters called the Great Mothers during his years in Peridea. The once again in his line to them, "Great Mothers, I shall once again require the aid of your dark magic," implies this wasn't the first time. What they'd apparently been doing in the years before Ahsoku's arrival was using Night Sister resurrection to replenish Thrawn's forces as soldiers died. The Night Troopers with the patched armour and the red cloth wrappings were, at least some of them, soldiers who had already died. The gold veining showing where the armour had been repaired mirrored the red fabric of the burial shrouds. In the Ahsoku finale, when Thrawn needed his forces to slow down Ahsoku, Sabine, and Ezra long enough to escape, he asked the Great Mothers to bless fallen Night Troopers, and they came back. With decaying flesh showing at the seams of the armour, Green Night Sister mist, the same visual signature as every other Night Sister resurrection in canon. They could only be stopped with direct hits to the head, which is an extremely specific detail that the show is clearly delighted to include. What makes this particularly interesting in the context of the wider Stormtrooper lore is that several troopers in the scene apparently volunteered to receive the blessing. They stepped forward. They consented in whatever sense consent operates in Thrawn's command structure to die and be raised as something that could die again and keep going. That level of dedication to a cause, or to a commander, is a specific kind of unsettling that's different from the chip and the conditioning and all the other forms of coercion in this lore. It was apparently freely chosen, or close enough to freely chosen as the story could manage. The Ahsoku series actually laid groundwork for the Night Troopers' nature earlier in its run, when the former Imperial Inquisitor Marok is killed by Ahsoku's lightsaber and dissolves into green smoke rather than collapsing as a living person would. The green mist is the Night Sisters' visual signature. It's what their magic looks like across all the animated series, the implication being that Marok had been dead for some time before the show even began, sustained by Night Sister resurrection before being deployed. The Great Mothers had been working with Thrawn for longer than the show initially revealed, and the Night Troopers were the large-scale application of a technique already tested on individual subjects. The burial cloth detail is worth a moment because it's such a specific piece of established lore being applied to a new context. The Clone Wars had been very clear about how Night Sister resurrection functioned mechanically. The deceased had to be placed in red burial pods before the spell could take hold. The red cloth wrapping the Night Troopers' battered armour isn't decorative. Someone wrapped the dead soldiers in Night Sister burial materials specifically so they could be raised if needed. That is a level of institutional planning for post-mortem military capability that the Star Wars universe had never quite encountered before, and I find it remarkable in a way that's difficult to fully articulate. After the Battle of Jakku, the Empire signed the Galactic Concordance and officially surrendered. Among other things, the treaty specifically banned the recruitment and training of stormtroopers. The Stormtrooper Corps was dissolved. A significant number of Imperial officers, nobles, and technologists refused to accept this arrangement and retreated to the unknown regions, the uncharted space at the galaxy's edge, to rebuild. What they built over the following decades became the First Order, and the First Order's approach to building a Stormtrooper corps was different from anything the Empire had attempted, in a way that the franchise, to its credit, treats with genuine seriousness. Commandant Brendel Hux was the Imperial officer most directly responsible for the First Order's military doctrine, and his core belief was that soldiers should be trained from birth. Not from adolescence, not from young adulthood, from infancy. Before they had identities, before they had attachments, before there was a self to be conditioning against. He had looked at the clone program and the Jedi program and extracted what he thought was the essential insight. The most reliable soldiers were the ones who had never known anything else. Project Resurrection was the operational program that put this into practice. The First Order employed a private security company called Janata Security to acquire infants. The word the First Order preferred was rescue. When a Resistance character confronts a First Order general about it in the novelizations and supplementary material, Project Resurrection, kidnapping children, the response is immediate and without apparent irony. Rescuing, forging them into an army, the likes of which this galaxy has never seen. Most of the children came from one of three sources: conquered worlds in the unknown regions where resistance was expected, children of former Imperial officers and personnel who might be considered to have had a kind of inherited obligation, or orphans from throughout the galaxy who had no families to notice them gone. In some cases, and this is the detail that I find most complicated, impoverished families gave their children up willingly, hoping for a better future, or simply having fewer resources than mouths they were trying to feed. The line between coercion and desperation in that category is not clean. The children were processed into induction camps, sorted into batches, separated from any prior connections. FN 2187 was in batch 8. They were given designation codes, trained under the supervision of people who are themselves products of the system. Captain Cardinal, the instructor depicted in the pre-Force Awakens novel Phasma, was himself a former child soldier who had been recruited by Brendel Hux personally before the First Order's Stormtrooper program formally existed. The conditioning was designed to be total. Not just training, but information management. Stormtroopers weren't taught that there was a galactic community they'd been removed from. They were taught that the First Order was a territorial protection force. The existence of the New Republic, the history of the rebellion, the context of what the First Order actually was within the broader political reality, this was controlled information, available only in forms that supported the narrative the First Order needed its soldiers to have. When Finn defected, one of the first things he encountered was the scale of what he hadn't been allowed to know. Reconditioning was the consequence for soldiers whose compliance was considered inadequate. Finn knew it was coming. He had failed to fire on civilians at Jakku, had stood with his weapon at his side while everyone around him followed the order, and he knew what would happen next. The reconditioning process isn't described in clinical detail in the films, but the implication is an intensive program of psychological realignment, and the fact that Finn was running as fast as he could to avoid experiencing it tells you what he thought of the prospect. There's a parallel that the Star Wars expanded universe has drawn, somewhat uncomfortably, between the First Order Stormtrooper program and the Jedi Order. Both organizations took children from families, the Jedi with parental consent, the First Order without it, but in both cases without the child's own consent, because the child was an infant. Both raised those children in an isolated institutional environment, separated from their birth families, trained in a specific doctrine from the earliest possible age. Both produced people who, if they were expelled from the institution, often had nowhere to go and nothing outside it to return to. The differences are significant. The Jedi allowed for individual development and didn't produce soldiers designed to kill on command, but the structural parallel is real, and the franchise acknowledges it in various places. Captain Cardinal, as depicted in the novel Phasma, is one of the more interesting characters in this corner of the lore. He's a former child soldier, recruited before the Project Resurrection program was formalized, shaped by Brendel Hux personally, into the first generation of what the First Order was trying to build. He spends the novel coming to terms with the specific ways the institution shaped him and the things he enabled in service of it. It's not a redemption arc exactly. The book is more honest than that, but it's a thoughtful character study of what it means to have been made, institutionally, into something, and to only understand that after the fact. There's a detail about how the First Order framed its mission to its soldiers that I find genuinely interesting from a psychological standpoint. The Stormtroopers weren't told they were an invasion army. They were told they were a defensive force protecting order in a dangerous region of space. The New Republic in this framing was the destabilizing force, corrupt, ineffective, unable to maintain the peace that the First Order was committed to preserving. This isn't just propaganda in the sense of false statements delivered to an audience that knows they're being propagandized. It's the foundational worldview instilled in people from infancy before they had the capacity to question it. The soldiers who carried out the First Order's operations genuinely believed, in most cases, that they were the good side. The resistance, in their understanding, was the threat. This makes the breakdown moment, the moment when a conditioning fails and a soldier perceives the reality of what they're actually doing, considerably more complex than it might appear. Finn on Jakku wasn't just disobeying an order, he was, in that moment, registering that everything he had been told about the world was wrong. That's a significant cognitive and emotional event to experience while standing in a desert. The thing about the First Order's conditioning program is that it was genuinely sophisticated. This wasn't a crude system. It had been refined over decades, built on the institutional knowledge of the Imperial Academy system and the Republic clone program, adjusted for the specific goal of producing soldiers with no prior life to return to, and Finn had never failed to comply before the events of The Force Awakens. He'd been through the entire program, made it to active deployment, been assigned to real operations. The system, by its own standards, had worked on him, and then he was standing on a dusty planet with his weapon raised, and there were actual people in front of him who hadn't done anything, and he couldn't do it. I find the specificity of that genuinely interesting. It wasn't a philosophical objection developed over time, reasoned out from principle. It was something more immediate than that, a direct encounter with the specific reality of what the Order meant, experienced in real time, that the conditioning couldn't fully contain. He'd been trained to follow orders. He'd been conditioned not to question. And in that moment, standing there, it didn't hold. The name Finn receives from Poe Dameron minutes later is worth dwelling on for a moment. Poe asks what his name is. Finn gives the designation code, which is the only name he has ever had. Poe says, "I'm giving you that," and offers Finn. It takes about 30 seconds of screen time. Finn accepts immediately, without hesitation or deliberation, because of course he does. He'd never had a name before, and here was someone treating him like the sort of person who ought to have one. It's a small moment, and it does a significant amount of work. Janna's story in The Rise of Skywalker adds another layer. She was also a former First Order Stormtrooper, and she hadn't defected alone. She'd led a mutiny of her entire unit, every trooper in it refusing an order simultaneously and walking away together, which suggests the conditioning has breaking points that aren't purely individual, that there are circumstances under which a group of people who've been through the same program can reach the same conclusion at the same time. What they couldn't do, afterward, was go home. They didn't know where home was. They didn't remember families. The program had been thorough enough that the lives they'd been taken from had no trace in their accessible memory. There are older examples in the Legends continuity. Abel 1707, a clone trooper whose transport went down during the Clone Wars, who survived alone on an uninhabited planet for more than 20 years. and who, when finally encountered by Luke Skywalker, chose the rebels. The chip hadn't stopped him because he hadn't been present for Order 686. A long enough solitary life had apparently done what nothing else could, given him enough distance from the institution that produced him to see it clearly. What these stories collectively suggest is that the system worked most of the time, on most people, and that a small number found the breaking point anyway. The franchise reads that as hopeful. I think it is, with some caveats. We'll come back to what it all adds up to a bit later. One detail about Finn that the sequel trilogy never quite has time to develop as fully as it might is the question of what he does with his experience of the First Order's conditioning. What it means to have spent your formative years having your perception of reality managed and your responses shaped, and then to have escaped and found yourself in a world where you have to make sense of everything you thought you knew. Rey, by contrast, had a relatively legible past, even if it was unhappy. Poe had a whole life before the Resistance. Finn has a set of skills, a designation code he's discarding, and the beginning of a name. The trilogy doesn't always know what to do with that, which is a shame, because the story of someone rebuilding a self out of those materials is genuinely interesting. Jannah and her group on Kef Bir represent one possible answer to that question. They walked away from the First Order together, which gave them each other as a reference point. They built something, not a society exactly, but a functioning community with its own internal logic, in a place remote enough to allow for some distance from everything they'd been part of. They're survivors who've created something small and real, and theirs. The Rise of Skywalker doesn't spend very long with them, but the detail of their existence is one of the more quietly optimistic things in that film. It would be easy, and not entirely inaccurate, to look at everything we've covered tonight and conclude that the Imperial military was entirely a system of coercion. Chips in heads, children taken from families, identities erased, and it was all of those things. But the story of the soldiers who joined voluntarily, who enlisted at Imperial academies out of genuine conviction, is a different kind of story, and one that I think the expanded lore handles unusually well. Claudia Gray's novel Lost Stars is the best single piece of evidence for what I mean. It follows two characters, Thane Kyrell and Sienna Rhee, from a backwater planet who both enlist in the Imperial Academy as adolescents and serve in the Imperial military across the entire span of the Galactic Civil War. They are not deceived in any simple sense. They are ambitious, intelligent people for whom the Imperial Academy represents an extraordinary opportunity. The Empire meant stability and order after the chaos of the Clone Wars, decent infrastructure, economic security, a path off a planet with limited options. They believe, at the point of signing up, that they are enlisting in service of something genuinely worthwhile. The novel's subject is the long, uneven, painful process of discovering what they've actually signed up to. Not through a single revelatory moment, but through accumulation, operations they participate in that don't feel right, orders that are followed despite private reservations, the gradual accretion of evidence that the institution they serve is capable of things they don't want it to be capable of. Some people in Lost Stars reach the point of reckoning sooner. Some don't reach it until very late, or frame what they've seen in ways that allow them to continue. The novel doesn't tell you this is simple or that everyone responds the same way, because it isn't, and they don't. What it establishes is that behind the faceless helmets, in the early years especially, were a lot of people who are not fundamentally different from anyone else, who had ordinary motivations, ordinary fears, ordinary human qualities, and who were embedded in an institution that was using those ordinary people to do extraordinary harm. The Stormtrooper who intimidates a village on an Outer Rim planet was, possibly, a person who signed up at 18 because it was the best available option, and who hasn't yet been forced to fully reckon with what the option entailed. This makes the Stormtrooper a more complicated figure than the original trilogy generally allows. A New Hope needed its faceless enemy to be exactly that, faceless threatening, a symbol of what the rebellion was fighting against. The expanded universe has spent decades quietly asking what was behind the face, and the answer is more ambivalent than anyone wearing that armor might prefer to think about. What Lost Stars does particularly well is track the specific moments of moral compromise. The times when a character notices something that doesn't fit the narrative they've been given about what they're serving and has to decide what to do with that discrepancy. Some people file it away and continue. Some people explain it to themselves in ways that make it fit the existing narrative through considerable mental effort. A small number eventually reach a point where the accumulated discrepancies are too large to contain. The novel is honest about the fact that this process is slow, inconsistent, and not particularly heroic in the moment it's happening. Most compromises don't feel like compromises when you're making them. They feel like practicality, or loyalty, or not having enough information to be sure. There's also a class dimension to the Imperial military that the lore occasionally acknowledges. The Stormtrooper Corps was primarily working class in its composition. People from planets with limited options, families who needed the income, young people for whom the academy was the most prestigious thing they had realistic access to. The officers' corps was more varied but trended toward the core worlds and families with existing Imperial connections. The gap between what the institution told the Stormtroopers they were doing and what the institution was actually doing was in some sense a gap that ran along those class lines. The people with access to the full picture were not the ones wearing the white armour. This also means that the people who most frequently paid the material cost of the Empire's operations, the Stormtroopers dying in Outer Rim engagements, the soldiers ordered to carry out occupation policies on resistant worlds, were often the people with the least understanding of the political decisions producing those orders. The officers who gave the orders understood, at some level, what the larger project was. The troopers who carried them out were often genuinely in the dark about the system they were serving. That's not an exculpatory observation, but it is a descriptive one, and I think the expanded universe at its best handles the distinction with some care. There's a recurring conversation in design criticism about why certain symbols of authority and intimidation become beloved over time, and the Stormtrooper helmet is probably the most prominent science fiction example of the phenomenon. The design was explicitly created to be threatening. The white was meant to evoke sterility and uniformity. The skull reading of the helmet, the empty eye sockets, the permanent downward expression, was presumably deliberate. George Lucas's brief was, as we've discussed, a being without expression, without feeling, without individuality. And yet, here we are. I've been thinking about why white specifically might be doing more work in this design than black would, because there's a counterintuitive thing happening. Death Troopers in their all-black armour are objectively intimidating, and also are not particularly iconic compared to standard Stormtroopers. Shadow Troopers are terrifying on paper, and yet the white is what endures. I think it might be because white, in this context, carries connotations that are specifically unsettling. Cleanliness, order, purity, civilization, and the collision between those connotations and the violence being enacted in white armour creates a dissonance that black armour would simply not produce. Black reads as threat. White reads as authority, claiming the right to do whatever it's doing, which is a different kind of frightening. The design also lands in a specific historical moment when the visual vocabulary of space opera was being assembled from scratch. Macquarie was pulling from Japanese samurai aesthetics, from medieval armour, from Art Deco and industrial modernism. The result was something that read as simultaneously ancient and futuristic, which is a difficult trick to pull off. The helmet looks like it has always existed. There's no visible assembly date, no obvious period styling. It belongs to no particular decade's idea of the future, which is part of why it hasn't dated in the way that so much 1970s science fiction design has. The manufacturing paradox that something created to represent dehumanizing authority became the most humanized element of the franchise, the thing fans dress as, the object people put in their homes, might ultimately say something about the limits of symbolic intent. Lucas and Macquarie made something too good. The design exceeded its brief. It was supposed to be a symbol of everything the heroes were fighting against, and it became a symbol of the franchise itself, beloved by the people who were also rooting for the heroes. Andrew Ainsworth made the first vacuum-formed helmets in a studio in Middlesex in 1976. The legal dispute about who owned the right to reproduce them ran for years. They sell at auction for significant sums. There is a replica sitting on a shelf in a great many ordinary houses next to the houseplants. The design that was built to say you will be oppressed has become something people put in their homes because it makes the room feel like somewhere worth being. That's not a failure of the design. I think it's actually evidence that it was the best possible version of exactly what it was trying to be. There's also the 501st Legion, which deserves a mention here because it's one of the more genuinely strange things to have emerged from the Star Wars cultural ecosystem. The 501st is a global fan organisation of people who build and wear Stormtrooper and other villain costumes. Thousands of members across dozens of countries with official Lucasfilm recognition and a significant charitable presence. They appear at events, hospitals, conventions. They're the people in the Stormtrooper armour at the fundraiser you went to. They build extremely detailed screen-accurate replicas of the armour that was designed to represent faceless, authoritarian soldiers, wear it in public and use it to raise money for charity. The 501st Legion was actually named for Darth Vader's personal unit from the Clone Wars, a battalion of clone troopers known for their distinctive blue-marked armour and their specific connection to Palpatine's most direct enforcer. The fan organisation chose the name precisely because it sounded like a realistic military unit, which is again the Stormtrooper paradox in miniature. The most oppressive element of a fictional authoritarian empire has become the beloved symbol of a charitable organisation. I don't think there's a tidy conclusion to be drawn from that, but it feels like something. After the Battle of Endor, after the Emperor died and Vader died, and the Death Star exploded for a second time, the Empire did not immediately cease to exist. The political and military infrastructure of a galaxy-spanning authoritarian state doesn't dissolve overnight. There were months of ongoing conflict, a Battle of Jakku roughly a year later. That was the Empire's final large-scale engagement, and then the Galactic Concordance, which was the formal surrender. The treaty banned Stormtrooper recruitment and training and officially dissolved the Corps. What this left, practically speaking, was an enormous number of people whose entire identity had been built around an institution that no longer legally existed. Some kept fighting for Imperial remnant warlords in the Outer Rim. The Mandalorian depicts this directly. Moff Gideon operating an illegal Imperial force with Stormtroopers fighting as part of a rogue Imperial remnant in violation of the Galactic Concordance, scattered across systems that the New Republic hadn't gotten around to stabilizing yet. They're not a disciplined, unified force. They're fragments of something that used to be much larger, operating with reduced resources and reduced mandate, in some cases genuinely fanatic, and in others just doing the only work they knew how to do. The Galactic Concordance's prohibition on Stormtrooper training was real in the core and inner rim, and largely theoretical on the outer rim, which is not an unusual gap between policy and practice in galactic governance. The New Republic had its own institutional problems, including a significant reluctance to maintain a standing military after everything the Clone Wars and then the Imperial era had produced with standing militaries. The space the New Republic left by reducing its forces was the space the First Order was quietly filling in the unknown regions for decades before the events of The Force Awakens. What happened to individual soldiers varied as widely as individual soldiers do. some integrated into civilian life, presumably the ones who'd had civilian lives before enlisting, or who'd maintained enough of a self through their service to build one. Some kept fighting, some disappeared into the Outer Rim and became something else entirely. The ex-trooper community on Kef Bir in The Rise of Skywalker, Janna's group, the ones who had mutinied and walked away, represent one possible answer to what happens after. You build something new with the people who left alongside you, in a place far enough away from the conflict that you can stop having to be a soldier. The First Order's defeat at the end of the sequel trilogy left a different, more acute version of the same problem. The people who had been raised from infancy as First Order Stormtroopers had, by definition, no memories of the lives they had been taken from to return to. They had no families to find, no civilian skills, no identity outside the institution that had just collapsed. What the films don't fully address, and what the extended material handles only in fragments, is what rehabilitation looks like for a generation of people who were taken before they could form memories and shaped entirely into instruments of someone else's will. That's a problem the galaxy would need to solve, and it's not a small one. The Legend's continuity has its own answer to what happens after, which is that Stormtroopers and their successors continued fighting under Imperial successor states for over a century after the original trilogy, serving governments that called themselves Imperial successors of one kind or another. In the old expanded universe, there were still soldiers in variants of that white armour well into the 130s ABY, carrying a military tradition forward across generations. Whether that continuity represents institutional resilience or institutional pathology probably depends on your perspective. What the current canon suggests, through the various Disney Plus shows set between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens, is that the New Republic underestimated the persistence of Imperial remnant forces quite significantly. The assumption that defeating the Empire's formal military structure would end the threat proved optimistic in ways that the Mandalorian, Ahsoka, and various other properties have been quietly exploring. The soldiers who kept going after the Concordance weren't an anomaly. They were the foreseeable consequence of an institution that had spent decades telling its members that what they were doing was righteous and necessary. That conviction doesn't dissolve with a treaty. There's a scene early in The Mandalorian where a group of remnant stormtroopers, scuffed armour, operating far from any central command, stationed on a backwater planet, are doing exactly what stormtroopers have always done. Maintaining a post, following orders, functioning within a chain of command that is now largely notional. The show doesn't spend much time on what these particular soldiers think about their situation, or how they ended up on this specific rock. It just shows them doing the job, the same way they presumably always have. There's something that feels true about that. Not an endorsement, but a recognition. Institutions end. The people shaped by them keep going for a while. The Kaminoans modified the Fett genome to reduce independence. That's the phrase I like to use. They took a genetic template and deliberately adjusted it to produce less of the quality that made the original individual effective at surviving on his own terms, and more of the quality that would make the copies useful to whoever was directing them. Less autonomy, more compliance, built in at the genetic level before anything else. And then a year into the Clone Wars, the clones were giving themselves nicknames. They were developing preferences for specific Jedi commanders. They were mourning each other's deaths with genuine grief. They were, despite everything the Kaminoans had done to prevent it, developing inner lives that the system hadn't accounted for and couldn't fully contain. Clone 99, the maintenance worker assigned to janitorial duties because his genetic abnormalities made him physically unsuited to combat, is probably the most direct expression of what this means. He was produced as a defect. He was kept at the facility as a curiosity or a useful body for non-combat tasks. And he was, by every account the show gives us, a person of real warmth and dignity, proud of his fellow clones in a way that wasn't resentful of their capabilities, genuinely cared for by some of them in return. The system didn't know what to do with him because the system wasn't designed to think about what a person with his particular set of constraints might be for. He died trying to defend the facility. He's one of the more quietly affecting presences in the Clone Wars. Rex's arc extended across the Clone Wars rebels, and at least one confirmed appearance at Endor is the longer version of the same story. A clone who was built to serve, who served with exceptional skill and genuine devotion, who had a chip in his head from before he was born that was designed to make him murder the people he'd been serving alongside, and who, through a combination of the warning Fives gave him and Ahsoka's intervention, managed to remove that chip and live past it. The Rebels version of Rex is an old man living quietly in the middle of nowhere, and the show treats that life with real respect. He made something for himself out of the materials a system had given him with entirely different intentions. The accelerated aging adds one final layer to all of this. The clones who survived and lived to old age did so in bodies that were aging twice as fast as everyone around them. Rex, Wolf, and Gregor in Rebels are physically ancient men who are chronologically not nearly as old as they appear. The sacrifice extended not just to what they were asked to do, but to the time they were given to do it in. The Kaminoans built in a shorter life alongside everything else. What the full arc of the Stormtrooper lore ultimately says, I think, is something about the relationship between systems and individuals. Every version of this army, the clones, the human recruits, the First Order's indoctrinated children, was designed by people who believed they could produce soldiers by suppressing the parts of a person that were inconvenient for military service. And every version produced people who found those parts anyway, slowly, incompletely, at great cost, often without enough time, but consistently. The system kept trying to make instruments and kept getting people instead. That's the most genuinely hopeful thread running through what is, in many respects, a quite dark body of lore. There's one more character from this corner of the lore worth mentioning before we move toward the end, and that's Omega. She's an enhanced female clone, a genetic anomaly, one of only a handful, who was kept in the Typoka City facility rather than being deployed. She joins the Bad Batch at the beginning of their series and becomes the emotional centre of the show across 3 seasons. Her existence is notable in the context of everything we've talked about tonight because she is, in some sense, what the system was never meant to produce. An individual who doesn't fit any of the designed functions, who insists on being a person in a situation that wasn't built for people. She's not a soldier, not a failed soldier, not a designated worker like 99. She's just someone who wants to be in the world and be known by the people she loves. The Bad Batch series, across its run, is fundamentally about a group of people who don't fit the system that made them navigating the collapse of that system and trying to find something worth living for on the other side of it. It's not always a cheerful show, but it treats its characters with a seriousness and consistency that I find genuinely moving, and it ends on a note that the whole arc of the Stormtrooper story has been circling since the Clone Troopers first started giving themselves nicknames. People are persistent, that turns out to matter. There's a kind of irony in the fact that the most hopeful version of this story is also the earliest one in the timeline. The clones, who had the least freedom in formal terms, who were the most overtly products of a system designed to suppress their individuality, were the ones who most insistently became individuals anyway. They didn't have the option of enlisting voluntarily or walking away or building a different life somewhere in the Outer Rim. And yet Rex ended up with a name and a face and a life that he chose, at least in part. Omega ended up with a family. Most of the Bad Batch ended up with each other. The system's most thoroughgoing attempt to make soldiers rather than people was also the attempt that produced the most visible evidence that it hadn't fully worked. I find that worth keeping in mind. The whole arc from Kumino to the First Order's fall covers roughly 7 decades of in-universe history and touches on some of the most persistent questions in moral philosophy, about free will and coercion, about complicity and conditioning, about what it means to have been shaped by an institution and whether you can be more than the shape it gave you. Star Wars doesn't always answer those questions with much rigour, and I'm not sure it needs to. What it does is keep asking them across different contexts and registers and generations of characters in ways that keep turning out to be interesting. The Stormtrooper, 50 plus years on, is still generating those questions. That's a remarkable thing for a piece of vacuum-formed white plastic to be doing. That's probably a good place to let things rest for tonight. We've covered quite a lot of ground: the design process, the clone army, and everything that was built into it before anyone was born, the long transition to human recruits, the specialised variants and the stranger corners of the lore, the First Order's approach to turning children into soldiers, and the various ways people manage to resist or survive or simply remain themselves, despite everything the system tried to do about that. There's more. There's always more with Star Wars. Individual clone commanders who deserve their own full evenings. The Bad Batch's extended story across 3 seasons of television. More Legends material than any reasonable person would want to try to cover in a single video, including some genuinely strange directions the early expanded universe took things. And the current Disney canon is still actively producing new corners of this mythology at a rate that makes it difficult to feel like you've ever fully arrived at the edge of it. What stays with me, settling into the end of this, is probably the inhibitor chips. The idea of something growing in your head from before you were born, dormant and undetectable, waiting for a command that would override everything you developed into in the years since. Fives knowing the truth and having no one believe him. Rex holding Fives as he died. The nightmares Tup described. The mission that kept appearing in his sleep. Kix